Recent visitors and speakers have included Shyam Saran, the former Foreign Secretary of India and President of the India International Centre, the writer Gurcharan Das, Sameer Saran, President of the Observer Research Foundation, drug regulation activist Dinesh Thakur, Sanjay Baru, media advisor to the late Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, Chinky Sinha, editor of Outlook magazine, Sanjeev Sanyal, member of the PM's Economic Advisory Council, and others. Since the past 5 years, and this is important because we are surrounded by writers, are we not? Since the past 5 years, we have supported writers through our Scholars in Residence program. We have so far hosted 12 writers for a period of 1 month, provided them with a stipend and a comfortable working environment, we hope, to work on their books. The result is that out of the 12, 5 have already published their books with some of the most prestigious publishers in India or abroad. I'll just list them out very quickly. Thomas Manuel, Opium Inc., how a global drug trade funded the British Empire, way back in 2021. Abhishek Chaudhary, Vajpayee, The Ascent of the Hindu Right, 1924 to 77, the first volume of a two-volume biography. Samrat Chaudhary, Northeast India, A Political History. And this year, in the last 6 months, Dinesh Sharma, Beyond Biryani, The Making of a Globalized Hyderabad, and Amrita Shah, The Other Mohan in Britain's Indian Ocean Empire. So 5 out of 12 is not a bad deal at all. We should have another 2 books coming out in the next 12 months. On behalf of ICG, I would like to thank our festival partners, Goa Writers, especially the curators Damodar Mauzo and Vivek Menezes. I would also like to thank Sonia Sabharwal for preparing the official GALF artwork, which you'll get to see in a few minutes. Not in a few minutes, maybe about 40, 50 minutes later. Thanks are due to all our sponsors and the many volunteers from colleges across Goa, without whom this festival would not be possible. On behalf of ICG, I would also like to thank our media consultant, Mr. Rahul Chandavarkar, somewhere around, our social media consultant, Mr. Michael Praveen, also somewhere around, and designer Sayali, who's not here with us, but in Pune. This year, like always, the media has been generous with their coverage of GALF, and we appreciate that very much. Thank you to all the speakers and delegates for joining us for GALF 2025, but I do not end here. Just a last paragraph. Finally, I would like to appreciate the efforts of the ICG team, so ably managed by Neelima Dasari. I think every delegate who is here has been communicating with her, and you have sent her emails asking about the schedule. Please, I mean, you can't be doing that. I mean, you should be asking Vivek. So Neelima has been very patient in handling all your emails, so please thank her. In the last few days, other staff members, Teja Nayak and Anupama Ghosh, as well as our support staff, the housekeeping staff under Sabina, and the front office have been of great help as well. All those delegates who are staying with us, you should know that your stay is made comfortable by the fact that Vivek Pathian, our general manager, is running the show. Okay, so if you run into Mr. Pathian, please thank him as well. So more than anyone else, 2 names you got to remember. Neelima Dasari, and also apologize to her if you sent her emails about, where's my schedule? Okay, so, and Vivek Pathian. I don't see him around, but he should be somewhere. Thank you, everyone. I have taken more than enough time.
Thank you, Dr. Pushkar. I brought a backup mic. It also looks like an award, I'd like to thank my mom and my dad, my fans out there. Or like Freddie Mercury, whoo! You can see one of the supporting teams out there, Goa Writers. Now that's a group of writers that's older than GALF. It was founded in 2005 through the initiative of Victor Angel Ribeiro, one of our senior writers. And it's a group of over 50, 60 writers who meet once a month. There were regular presence online through the Goa Writers Gmail, Google group. And we have the co-curators of this festival as very active members of this group, Damodar Mauzo and Vivek Menezes. They are the backbone of this festival. They have been so since 2010. We've had a lot of great writers here at the festival. Anant Murthy, you are Anant Murthy, Gulzar, Amitav Ghosh, Teju Kol, Ramchandra Guha, and we've had a lot of the Goa writer members here as well. We have Isabel here among us, and she's been active. There's a whole team of Goa writers members who have always been very active on this festival. There's Agust Pinto there. Agust. There you are. And Frederick Norona, Salil Chaturvedi, Sheila Jayawant, Anirudh Sen Gupta. There's many writers who have been actively involved in this festival. So to also say something about the festival and talk about the writers at this edition, I will call one of our co-curators. We all know Bai Damodar Mauzo. Yes, Bai, I know Vivek is going to do the honors, but I have to say something about you. We all know Bai. He is very close to our heart. He had the recent great honor of being a Jnanpith awardee. His stories, I think the Konkani stories that he has written are the most widely translated into English today. And he is also known, is very beloved to us for the work he has done for the recognition of Konkani as our state language, as the language of Goa. His fellow curator, Vivek Menezes, is very well known on the arts and literature circles. He's a 3-time Serendipity curator and widely published photographer and writer. He takes great pride in his photographs as well, and a real brother to me. So I request Vivek to address the gathering of writers.
Big hand for our Jose Lorenzo friends, founder member of the Goa Writers Group and one of the very best short story writers we have. We love you, Jose. Thank you all also to Pushkar and Nilima and the tremendous team ICG led by its president Yatin Kakodkar for the warm hospitality and constant support that has made this event happen 13 times over a full decade and a half. Friends, the last time I looked out on this very scene at the 2024 GALF Inaugural, there was Tarun Bhartia smiling in the back row. And he kept on smiling all the way through the next 3 days. We lost Tarun suddenly a short while ago, gone far too young. And the loss is immense. Tarun was an extraordinary filmmaker and also one of the greatest photographers of our time. His oeuvre is comparable to the masters of the genre, Sunil Jana from India, but also the likes of Sebastião Salgado. But that is not all, because he also created and curated the brilliant, highly inspirational Riot online magazine, an invaluable intellectual and artistic and most essential platform for the independent world view of all those who live in and around his home state of Meghalaya. It is interesting that when Tarun arrived in Goa last year, that smile I was talking about never left his face for 3 days. And at the end, he told a television interviewer that it felt to him like he had left his family in Shillong only to come home again in Panjim. He felt kindred instantly with a sense of belonging that goes far beyond the obvious. He recognized this place where he had never been before, and of course, we recognized him too. How can that be? Is that connection real? Friends, for Tarun and for me, and for you too, hopefully, what I'm talking about is extremely real and significant and makes a big difference in our day-to-day lives. And to understand that unusual truth, that seemingly contradictory truth, I'd like to take us back to 2010. Friends, those 15 years since GALF was founded seem to have flown by on supersonic wings. And certainly our dear Bhai has remained evergreen, absolutely evergreen. But in fact, we live in a very different world from back then. At that time, two separate entities came together to pursue this idea. On the one hand, the former director of this institution, Nandini Sahai, had attended Jaipur. So thank you for that, Mr. Dalrymple, wherever you are. But our Bhai, Damodar Mauzo, had already been developing his own idea for a festival to incorporate the arts in the name of the great Goan exemplars, the poet Bakibab Borkar, and his very dear friend Angelo da Fonseca. With that vision backed by the Goa Writers Group in partnership, a robust partnership with ICG, this event was founded on the logic that has evolved from very long experience of the writers and artists of Goa. Friends, my dear friend Ranjit Hoskote, who's here with us today, has described Goa very aptly as an invisible river that has profoundly enriched India and the world, but is barely recognized and generally misunderstood in doing so. This extremely ancient little slice of the Konkan coastline has been a crucible of what is now called globalization for literally thousands of years, as far back as human history has been written. Open the annals, and Goa is always there, always open to the world, always the crossroads, always the entrepot. Many years ago, Amitav Ghosh stood in this very place with a marvelous GALF keynote, which I've read from previously, but please indulge me once again. Amitav writes, I have long been fascinated by cosmopolitanism, and the one thing I've learnt about it is that it is rarely to be found where one might expect. The cosmopolitanism of New York, for instance, where he lives, is a kind of provincialism, for it assumes that its existence is proved by the mere fact of having a variety of cuisines at its disposal. Similarly, it's perfectly possible to travel very widely and yet remain completely provincial. European colonial officials made a practice of this in the 19th and 20th centuries, and World Bank functionaries excel at it today. One of the ways in which Goa is new, says Amitav, is that it has invented a new kind of cosmopolitanism that is peculiarly its own. It is a cosmopolitanism of lived experience, a cosmopolitanism of inner dialogues, where the outsider becomes a part of the inner voice, sometimes embraced and sometimes excoriated. This voice is nonetheless not ignored, as it might be elsewhere. Friends, when Goa Writers and ICG and Bhai and I first started thinking about GALF, we were clear about several things. First of all, even in those days, 15 years ago, it was obvious there was a fast emerging post-liberalization, commercially driven mainstream consensus about the literature and the arts in India. To us, from Goa, this kind of thinking has always seemed like a dangerous simplification of this country's unbounded, incredible, cacophonous, profound plurality. Certainly, even then, our Goa and the Konkan were already left out of this consensus. And of course, we are still left out in an age-old pattern I do not have to remind this audience about. But at that time, we were also aware that many other parts of the country and languages and entire genres were also being left out in exactly the same way. So, from the very beginning, our festival took inspiration from an acute line by the late, great Eunice D'Souza, who said, there are ways of belonging. 5 words, so simple, but they have become an awesome bedrock and framework for this festival. And that is why the best part of our legacy has been an unwavering focus on what others may consider the periphery, or marginal, or irrelevant. The result, my friends, as so many of you know and have experienced, and often tell us here at GALF, the result has been an awe-inspiring coming together. That explains why Tarun immediately felt at home in a place he had never been before. Look from my eyes right now, with all of you gathered here from the various parts of the world and India, I know where you've come from. I know that what we have created is real. And at the core of it, I recognize Goenkarpon. I recognize that this is what Goa has always offered the world. And I'm very proud to stand here today in the living expression of our soul and our culture. Friends, it was a blink of an eye, but we live in a very different world from 2010. At that time, one of the early pillars of our event was rekindling Goa's long-standing, century-old collections to Karachi. And Pakistani writers were a mainstay of GALF until those doors were closed. We reached across in our years again and again to Bangladesh. But now those barriers are also too high. At one time, the Chief Minister of Kashmir, then and now, Omar Abdullah, flew to Goa with an entire delegation of over 30 writers and artists, people who might not meet in Srinagar, but over here we met and gathered and shared. But now that kind of thing seems impossible. The constraints are many. And here I must specifically thank Yatin Kakodkar for keeping the faith in the power of art and literature, and without whom, Bhai and I are fully aware GALF would be impossible. Yatin can tell you best of all that our constraints are many, and our concerns are even more. From the shadows, we seem to hear whispers. What if they say the unsayable? What if they have too many of those people? Look at the lineup. There's a bookseller from Imphal. 2 Africans. Thank you for coming, Shabnam and David. You really can't trust those poets. That one I agree with. Friends, let us not pay attention to the shadows. We are much, much better than that in Goa. These current geopolitical fashions are just another blip in our open world, in our open world view. Remember that just 1,000 years ago, a brief 1,000 years ago, in the ancient Kadamba port, the great Kadamba port just up the river, those rulers were wise and canny and comfortable and secure enough to name an Arab as the prime minister. Remember that for many, many years, Goa was the centerpiece of an extremely far-flung Estado de India for centuries. And this capital here held sway from Mozambique to Macau, connected Brazil and the Philippines. The world has always been here. This is an open window to the world by its very nature. The truth is the truth, and everything else is just propaganda. This, my friends, is perhaps part of the great unsayable. Last year, in his incandescent address to this very gathering, my friend Ranjit, I'm starting to realize I rely too much on my friend Ranjit for these pearls of wisdom, but my friend Ranjit pointed out that writers and artists are always told this is not the right time and this is not the right audience. This is not the wisest strategy. This is far too controversial in nature. But why are we writers and artists? We are writers and artists precisely because we have found our voice. And events like this are precisely the best time, as he said, quote, to raise our voices, for together we are polyphony, we are community, we are assembly, we are solidarity. In solidarity with each and every one of you, and with every writer and artist and reader and thinker and believer who may watch this later. The Goa Arts and Literature Festival belongs to you. Moga Sundi Deobarikuru.
Thank you, Vivek. What if they say the unsayable? What profound words, what poetic lyrics. In the past, for the 5 or 6 times that I've hosted this event, I have taken it upon myself to educate the very distinguished writers here on our own mother tongue, Konkani. And I have been giving them lessons, just one phrase to learn every, every edition of the festival. So let us see if you all still remember. How do you say good morning, a good day to you? How do you say it in Konkani? Well, you can repeat it after me. Deo boro dis diu. Would you please repeat after me? Deo boro dis diu. May God give you a good day. And what comes after that is easy. You should get it. How do you say good night? Deo bori raat diu. Raat is night in many languages. So, as a good priest would say, repeat after me. Deo bori raat diu. Deo bori raat diu. And how do you say thank you? Vivek has just used this phrase. How do you say thank you in Konkani? Deo boren koru. So it's, may God be good to you. I guess God is entangled a lot in our Konkani language. You don't hear this in Hindi much, do you? Bhagwan tera din, apka din acha karo. Aisa, I mean, my Hindi is not very good, but we have it in Konkani. I can hear someone laughing there. So, yeah, you all have done pretty good. And Mo Gasundi, just these 2 words, such beautiful words. Let there be love between us. So that's your Konkani lesson for this time. There have been many great keynote speakers that have graced these occasions. And among them have been your Anand Murthy, Gulzar, Amitav Ghosh, Mridula Garg, Eunice D'Souza, Ramchandra Guha, Raj Mohan Gandhi. I love to hear him speak. And we've heard pearls of wisdom, nourishing words from them. And today we have 2 keynote speakers with us. The first of them is Shumona Roy. She's the author of 2 works of non-fiction. One is How I Became a Tree. It talks about what it is to be human in the natural world among animals and plants. And her second book is Provincials, Postcards from the Peripheries, where she writes about how people from small towns are equal and as good as their urban peers. She has also written Plant Thinkers of 20th Century Bengal. It's a work of literary criticism. Missing, a novel. My Mother's Lover and Other Stories, and 2 collections of poems out of syllabus, and VIP, very important plant. Shumona teaches at Ashoka University, and I request her now to give us her keynote address. So you've got this slide here. That's good.
This is okay.
It's okay.
I think it is. Good evening, and I have many, many people to thank. First, Vivek, one provincial reaching out to another, a stranger about 8 years ago, the earliest supporter of my work. Thank you to you and your family. Damodar Bhai and Pushkar for your warmth and hospitality. To my co-keynote speaker, it's an honor to be speaking at the same time and on this stage as yourself. To the 2 of you, to many of you here, whom I have to presume that you are here because I'm just coming out of eye surgery and cannot see you very well. I think I just saw Annie somewhere. Now she's disappeared from my... Hi. I don't know whether or how I'll have your attention. We like to hear only about ourselves. by which I mean not just ourselves as individuals, but as a species. The first novel in the English language begins with, I was born at York in the year 1632. It doesn't, for instance, begin with the history of a particular plant or animal on the island he eventually finds himself in. Or, if I were to ask you about Leonardo da Vinci's most famous painting, you would know the trivia about Mona Lisa's missing eyebrows, but you would all struggle to remember whether there are any trees behind her in the background. As in the painting, and as the history of portraiture reveals to us, the human is at the center of the frame of our attention. Everything else is peripheral, both to knowledge systems and the artists, and consequently, the reader's attention. I think you will remember whom you are sitting next to here, but you'll forget that miraculously beautiful tree over there. It must have been my conditioning as a peripheral creature growing up in the provinces, in the foothills of a sub-Himalayan Bengal town, that had made me interested in those who live in the penumbra. My interest in plant life, in photographing walls of northern Bengal over decades, writers and artists from a minority tradition, probably comes from there. What I'm going to share with you over the next few minutes is something I've noticed from my research and interest on the relationship between humans and plant life. Over the last 100 years and a little more, scientists, artists, musicians, writers, filmmakers have, through their various media, been trying to find out the language of plants. The word language is not accidental, it's one they keep using. Let me put it rather bluntly. We, as a species, have been engaging in a quest to discover the plant script. It is this that I want to share with you today. There are quite a few reasons behind my decision to do so. The first is this, and I want you to think about this. What does it say about us at this point in human history if we are all thinking so seriously, or perhaps not even so seriously, about the plant script? The second is this. The quest for the plant script began in India. It is this story that I want to share with you. 2 months before the start of the First World War, Jagadish Chandra Bose was giving a talk about plant autographs and their revelations to the Royal Institution of Great Britain. He begins his talk with he uses this word, science of handwriting. Bose recognizes the unreliability of such a science. He's a scientist after all, but still chooses it to explain plant behavior. And I quote, so when I'm quoting, I'm actually translating Bose from Bangla into English. Under a placid exterior, there is also a hidden history in the life of the plant. Storm and sunshine, warmth of summer and frost of winter, drought and rain, all these and many more come and go about the plant. What coercion do they exercise upon it? What subtle impress do they leave behind? Is it possible to make the plants write down their own autographs and thus reveal their hidden history? Unquote. What Bose is seeking, therefore, is not autograph alone. Through it, he's seeking autobiography, the hidden history. Vivek just mentioned the unsayable. The name of Jagadish Chandra Bose's book is Obbakto, that can be translated into the unsaid or the unsayable. The hidden history, the Obbakto of plants. Writing this during the high tide of modernism, particularly British and European modernism, when the autobiography was becoming the most interesting site for experiments in writing and art, and also an entry point for those who had been kept out of literature and culture by gatekeepers, this urge for both the autograph and autobiography of the plant seems natural, at least the literary and cultural world, if not in the sciences. The sciences, like so much of historiography today, tells us someone's story, of animals, objects, metals, the elements, the stars, and of course of plants. Jagadish Chandra Bose is signaling for a move from literature about them, a world available to us only in reports and paraphrase, to a directness that has been denied to everyone besides those who have had no agency to speak to humans in a shared language. So you see, he's almost inaugurating subaltern studies about 50 years before subaltern studies. I quote again in my translation from Bose, "Are there similarities between our nervous system and the plants? Can the changes in speed be recorded by the plant itself? Do plants have muscles like there are in the human heart? In the end, when death comes to a tree, is it possible to record that moment of nirvana? And does the tree respond fiercely to that moment before falling into an everlasting sleep? Only a history of these different moments, captured by different instruments, will give us the true and uninterrupted history of plant life." Unquote. As you recognize, this is the language of affection, of imploration, and indeed of activism, which we now think only for the human subject. I continue to quote from Bose. "To know the real history of plants, we must go to the plants themselves. That history is mysterious and complicated. To retrieve that history, machines will have to record every moment of a plant's life from birth to death. The script will have to be written by the plant itself, and it must have the plant's autograph. This is because men are often deceived by their motive." Unquote. And then we are allowed entry into the imagination that designed a variety of instruments, none of which seemed to have satisfied him completely, for he was always trying to design another one more sophisticated and acknowledging of the invisible life and history of plants. Some of these names, many of you might be familiar from junior science in school. The electro-optic analog, the shielded lens antenna, the resonant recorder, the phytograph, the plant phytograph, automatic photograph, the bubbler instrument, and of course the most well-known among them, the cresograph. The design of these instruments came from his living in both the physical and the botanical sciences. In this, his sole collaborator was a tinsmith by the name of Putiram Das. He wanted plants to write their own autobiography in their own script, Toru Lipi, the plant script. Toru is plant and Lipi is script in many languages. His plant philosophy is one of the most non-anthropocentric practical philosophies by a human that I have possibly encountered. But it wasn't Jagadish Chandra Bose alone who was searching for a plant script. Rabindranath Tagore, who called Bose his first friend, Amar Prothom Bondhu, was trying to understand Phuler Bhasha, the language of flowers. What is this language of flowers, and why does Tagore turn to it as a metaphor to hold the lack of understanding of the ways of the mind? One notices in Rabindranath the groping for an analogy of the same interest, curiosity, and bafflement about the language of flowers as he does about other human languages, the syntax of the mind and the flowering world. The language of the flowers, which once in bloom, cannot be erased or undone. So we cannot press delete or undo. Phota, or blooming, is the foreign language that Tagore wants to understand. If I have to identify a refrain of thought in these songs about plant life, it is this: the curiosity about the language of plants, his acknowledgement about their unique form and fragrance as their language, his desire to understand both their lang and parole, and the impossibility of doing so. In one song, which I translate or paraphrase very badly because it is impossible to translate Rabindranath, he sings or says, "None of you," and it's almost as if he's addressing us here, "none of you will be able to make flowers bloom, no matter what you say or how hard you try, whether you lift it up day and night or injure its stalk, you won't be able to make it bloom. You might make it look faded or pale by staring at it constantly. You might tear apart its petals and branches and throw it to dust. Even if the noise and chaos you create might force its mouth open, you won't be able to take its color or rid it of its scent, he says in a song. It is quite obvious that Rabindranath is trying to understand a language that he recognizes, beyond the obvious, as not having originated from the human. We're so used to thinking of language as something that we've created. How does one understand such a language? Tagore goes to it both as a child and a linguist, imploring that understanding of communication as reaction and response, an intuition he shares with his friend Jagadish Bose. He locates the trigger of this language like the scientist did in light. But he also goes beyond that in locating the personality of the intelligence that has created this script. He's seeking both author and intention. What kind of language is this? He seems to be asking us, mother tongue or father tongue? Like language whose nature it is to generate response, the blooming of flowers is a sign that one must understand. Rabindranath understands it in various ways. And I'd like you to consider your own thoughts about blooming and blossoming and the falling of flowers and leaves when you think about Rabindranath. Where there is flower, there will be plucking. Is that part of its language too? This intuition of pollinator, this other possible end to life, to its life, like its transition to fruit is? We also encounter a different intuition. Is plucking flowers right? What is its equivalent in language besides perhaps it being ungrammatical to life? Falling and blooming, these are the two poles between which Rabindranath situates his plant language. It is not completely different from the parenthesis we use to mark the arrival and departure of a human citizen. That flowers bloom every day is both a thing of wonder and confusion for Rabindranath. He's seeking history and geography and geology in this flower linguistics. When I read Rabindranath, I sometimes wonder whether he saw the blooming of flowers as direct speech, flowers as beings that must exist inside quotes. That was 100 years ago. In April 2023, that's about 2 years ago, nearly 2,000 years of that urge to find the language of plants was collected by Katie Holton in her book, The Language of Trees, A Rewilding of Literature and Landscape. The book begins with what Holton calls a tree's typeface, a rewilding tool. On the left-hand page of the book is a tree's typeface, a tree alphabet, its name almost a continuation of a quest that began with Jagadish Bose's plant script. Holton, an artist, has chosen a tree, more specifically its shape for each letter of the alphabet. I wish I could have showed it to you, but we can't here. So A for apple, B for beech, and cedar, dogwood, elm, fir, ginkgo, horse chestnut, and juniper, and Kentucky coffee tree, linden, mulberry, and so it continues to sycamore, tree of heaven, umbrella tree, yellow woods, alcova, from A to Z. Holton does not choose A for apple because it is easy and obvious, the way we meet A for apple in, at the age of 3, for instance, in a school textbook. She chooses it for its form, for the visual resemblance between the structure of a generic apple tree and the letter A, turning a private manner of seeing into a very public typeface. Holton is an artist. Bose was a scientist. Bose's understanding of this language was through response, which is how plants and indeed our muscles and bones find form. Holton is recording form as well, but their positions on the arc are different. Bose wants to know the reason why plants are speaking or communicating in this way. Holton records without questions. Bose wanted to see this as autobiography and by extension history, plant history, thus giving them agency. Holton, with her eyes on effect, not cause, records the bones of what she sees. The Roman script on the right page, the tree script on the left, crowded when it's a long excerpt, almost analogous to a forest, spaced out when it's a single sentence excerpt, almost like a park hedge. The chapters are called seed, soil, saplings, buds, bark, branches, forest, family trees, tree time, roots and resistance, after trees, and so on. After noticing the obvious division of the book into its constituents as if it were a tree, evidence of a heightened analogous imagination between the human and the plant that marks our times. I myself am guilty of this in my book, How I Became a Tree. You notice the language, the alliterations, the seeds, soil, saplings, buds, bark, branches, flower, fruits, forests, family trees, roots, resistance. And you wonder whether this poetic device that has been in use for millennia could actually be the language of trees. Halton uses a tree form for and, the way and exists on our keyboard, for instance. It resembles the shape of a V. And if you look around at any tree around us, or even any plant around us, a tree tongue connecting two branches like the conjunction in a sentence does. I ask you to think about it. Does plant life know this conjunction? Where can we locate the and in the form of a tree? The urge to hear from the other side and not about the other side has changed the idea of the plant script in the 20th and 21st century. Botanical art, some of which I found in the way what you are wearing today, the two of you, for instance, and also in the frames at the ICG. Botanical art, a manner and mannered way of seeing plant life, whether as a species or its constituents, is no longer unidirectional. It is no longer a record of the human looking at the plant. The quest for the language of plants for its scripts is now an investigation, as all art is an investigation, into how and whether the other force, so far the non-actor, the plant itself, could create art. Like Bose tried to record the response of plants to external stimuli, artists want to record the autonomous behavior of plants or their paths to the elements. Art, therefore, is now about trying to understand the behavior of the plants, even as artists behaving like scientists put them in unexpected situations. I think most of you here would be familiar with E. Cummings's poems, A Leaf Falls with Loneliness. So the leaf falling, so it doesn't move from left to right, but from top to bottom. So a leaf falls, then L-O-N-E, then I, then, I-N-E-S-S, and so on. So leaf falls with loneliness, and yet in the script we find it in company, sometimes one letter, sometimes two, even three. This one particularly ironic, for it has the word one. There are many L's in the poem. They are the inaugural sounds of both leaf and loneliness. Even when they fall in company, as you would have noticed about the falling of leaves, they are alone, lonelier than they were on a branch. That is why Cummings's poems is a deconstructed branch, the leaves together, but not connected by any glue, such as the branch. Almost the way letters are in an alphabet. It's interesting to see that Cummings turns to the last phase of a leaf's life when he thinks of a plant script, though of course he does not use the word. Octavio Paz does the same. His poem is titled Coda. And I quote, "Perhaps to love is to learn to walk through this world, to learn to be silent like the oak and the linden of the fable, to learn to see. Your glance scattered seeds, it planted a tree. I talk because you shake its leaves." Paz borrows a few things from human language. First, the oral, silence, to learn to be silent like the oak and the linden of the fable. Again, going back to what Vivek said in his inaugural welcome note about the unsayable. After silence, which is of course the first letter of any alphabet, we think of A or or K as the first letter of the alphabet. We often forget that silence is the first letter of any alphabet. The analogical imagination about the language of trees or plants is older than the written script. It is perhaps for this reason that when the script begins to emerge in our histories, particularly the page and binding, languages begin reflecting this. What else can explain why the Bangla word for leaf and page are the same, pata? Similarly with Hindi, panna derives from the Sanskrit parna, meaning leaf. The Japanese manuoshu has been translated as collection of 10,000 leaves. In the early spring of 2023, I discovered, like many of you, through social media, that plants cry when deprived of water or injured. Researchers writing about their experiments with tomato and tobacco plants in the journal Cell had proved that, quote, stressed plants emit airborne sounds between 40 and 80 kilohertz. The reason we cannot hear them. I thought, of course, of Jagadish Chandra Bose, whose Torulipi, the plant script, is a record of a plant under stress, its injuries. If recent research proves Bose's deductions from more than a century ago that plants cry, does it leave out the possibility of laughter in the plant world? This is my question to you today. Is it possible for living beings without eyes to respond to the world with laughter? When I teach the rasa theory to my students, we often discuss their human-centeredness. We wonder whether we could imagine the same set of emotions and responses in a world beyond humans. Could they hold true for plant life, for instance? Jagadish Bose was mocked for his claims about plant sentience by a colonial scientific establishment, particularly in the United States. As I run through the list of rasas, I think of scientists in the last 100 years since Bose, having worked towards proving that plants do indeed feel many of these feelings that you and I do, the ones related particularly to stress and consequently impending death. But laughter? Why should laughter, hasyaras, be alien to the plant world? The leaves of the touch-me-not fold when touched. All of us know this. You tickle the trunk of a tree called gudgudi or tickle tree in Uttarakhand, and the leaves on the branches begin to move. I quote, "At first you think that it might be the wind tickling it," says the environmental journalist from whose video I first learned about such a tree in Katarnia Ghat. And he says, then you realize that it's not the air, for the leaves of no other tree in its surroundings are moving. Unquote. This is the thing, that the tree's response to the air, as in the shiver of the leaves, does not surprise us, but its response to tickling does. Charles Darwin, in trying to understand laughter and its place in evolution, argued that our response to tickling is not very different from our response to a joke. One must be in a light state of mind to be able to respond to both with laughter, he insisted. And of course, surprise is necessary to produce laughter. Did he mean to imply that only those with minds were capable of laughter? We know that many animals are ticklish, but trees? As scientific research reveals a new history of emotions in plant studies, and I think you might too, want to hear the laughter of the trees. We know from our own experience what causes us to smile, what causes us to laugh. In Shiliguri, where I come from, where public trees have been lost to the construction of the Sark Highway, in Goa, in Uttarakhand, in provincial India, now drugged by the steroids of development, where is the plant life whose laughter we might be able to hear? Is it a coincidence that as we have become more and more distant from plant life, in a way that we no longer live in a world where we can take the neighborliness of plants for granted, we as a species have been driven by the urge to discover their language, their script? Isn't this the way morbid capitalism works? By making us try to remember and archive and cherish something capitalism itself has killed or destroyed? Thank you.
Thank you, Shimona. That was amazing. An expansion of language to all living beings around us. Perhaps 1,000 years from now, I won't be around, but the host will have the pleasure of introducing Ficus bengalensis as a keynote speaker, or Mangifera indica. Yeah. And I also found it quite interesting that a black and white dog tried to enter, and maybe he wanted to say something, and we haven't been able to understand him. I also found it strange that in all these Konkani proverbs that we have, I have published a kind of a little desk calendar with 365 proverbs. There is no mention of books, no mention of writing, at least as far as I know. But there is a lot of reference to Zada, Muda, Gormogriak, people. You know, they keep referring to trees and plants and animals and take the wisdom and aphorisms from those elements. And they don't really talk much about books and writers. So perhaps we are a bit bereft of wisdom there. And now for our second keynote address, we have Ms. Shanta Gokhale. She's a novelist, columnist, playwright, translator, theatre critic, and screenwriter. Besides 3 novels in Marathi, she has published various books on Marathi and Indian theatre. Her literary work of 60 years has won her many accolades and awards, among them being the Sangeet Natak Akademi Award for contribution to the performing arts, and the Sahitya Akademi Award for her translation of Lakshmibai Tilak's autobiography. Ms. Gokhale.
Because my eyes are very bad. Sorry, I can't see you, but I can't see this either. No. Yeah, but then I have to go so far, and then my specs don't work.
Is it possible? I mean, this is difficult for her to.
Oh, okay, let's see how we can manage. No, this is fine. I think so, yeah. When Bhai Mauzo sent a two-line email to me saying, would you give the keynote address at GALF? And normally, when I'm asked to speak, my first instinctive reaction is to find excuses to say no. I'm not a happy speaker, but I instantly said yes to him. And that was because I love being here. It's just the place that is so magical that bearing a bit of pain in having to speak to earn it, I didn't mind at all. Even now, someone is playing basketball in my stomach. Now, as I came from the airport through a fantastic greenery and the quietness, the peace, and the splendid Zwari River flowing by. I thought to myself, what a silly idea you had for your keynote address, because the thing I'm going to speak on is silence. And the reason is because all of us create whatever we write out of our immediate circumstances. And mine in the last 2 years have been particularly painful. 3 buildings in front of my house have been demolished. 3 buildings behind my house have been demolished, more or less at the same time. The human noises that this has produced were staccato, bang, interval, bang, interval, bang, interval. And at the end of the day, one had a headache. And also the unfortunate question, why am I trying to write, for God's sake? Demolition over, construction begins. And then we have machine sounds. And it isn't enough of a diversion for me to find words for the sounds that I hear. Thud, crash, wheeze, screech, whine, grate. All these sounds were being made all around me, setting my teeth on edge and really producing in me something that I think isn't part of me at all. A great urge to do violence. But then what did I do? I didn't go and throw the earth mover over into the sea. What I did was, of course, close my eyes, sit still, and try and absorb the noise. Meanwhile, telling myself that Mahatma Gandhi, with all his moral power, was still powerless against post-industrial noise. He lamented, before modern civilization came upon us, at least 6 to 8 hours of silence out of 24 were vouchsafed to us. Modern civilization has taught us to convert night into day and golden silence into brazen din and noise. What a great thing it would be if we, in our busy lives, could retire into ourselves each day for at least a couple of hours and prepare our minds to listen in to the voice of the great silence. The divine radio is always singing if we could only make ourselves ready to listen to it. But it's impossible to listen without silence. And yet, Gandhi did not live to experience the world in which our post-industrial noise is being amplified by information noise, where René Descartes' succinct statement of rationality, I think, therefore I am, has been replaced by I shout, therefore I am. In such a world, it is only art that offers us small islands of silence. I once heard Pandit Udayat Bhavarkar, the Dhrupad singer, sing Rag Bhairav in the morning. His alaps created a space for us that erased our own physical space. And at one point in his meditation on the melody, when he had reached the upper octave, he halted at a note and held that note without drawing breath, allowing his voice to grow gradually thinner and thinner till it was no more than a glittering point of sound, which then faded imperceptibly into silence. In that silence, beyond the last audible sound, we thought we heard a universe of unheard sound. Perhaps that was the divine radio singing, or the spheres making their music. Most artists themselves need silence before their work begins. Dr. B.N. Goswami, the art historian, has narrated his experience of being in Zurich to attend an Indian arts festival organized by a local museum. There was to be a Kudiyattam performance one evening, and the curator of the museum thought it might be interesting for visitors to observe what was happening backstage before the performance. Quite a few people turned up. What they saw was actors grinding pigments, grinding pastes in complete silence, then meticulously applying those pigments and pastes to each other's faces, also in complete silence. Each stripe, swathe, and spot of color had to be applied just so, because each signified the character that the actor was to play. The process appeared tedious and interminable to the Swiss observers. Finally, one of them whispered to Dr. Goswami, "Why don't they use ready-made cosmetics? Would that not cut down on the time?" Dr. Goswami interpreted the question to the Guruji, who drew him aside and said in a low voice, "Please tell them that we need this time of silence because we are preparing to enter the world of the gods this evening." This is an experience that artists have narrated again and again. Prabhakar Barve, the artist, describes something similar in his book, Kora Canvas. The artist sits before a blank canvas, staring at it just as blankly. In a while, the canvas begins to look less blank. The artist begins to notice the weave of the canvas, an occasional knot in it, an ant scurrying across the frame. And soon, the canvas begins to throw up shapes and meanings. And then, as Barve puts it, the surface gives way to unsuspected depths where the artist's imagination rapidly follows. But this happens only because the artist has silenced the noise in his head, the noise made by thoughts, feelings, and ideas that he has brought in from outside the canvas. Unless his mind is empty, his imagination will not create fresh, new images. He says, when the artist's mind breaks through the layers of accumulated thought and attains its pristine state, it is as though a patch of deep blue sky has broken through a thick cover of gray cloud. Peter Brook, the theatre director, understood the importance of silence in releasing human imagination. For that reason, he practiced great economy in stage settings to cut down on visual noise. A bare stage offers the audience the silence that will free their imagination. That is his theory. But not everybody is looking for silence. When Brook brought his play, The Mahabharata, to Mumbai, the 1,000-seater auditorium was packed. But 15 minutes into the play, the audience became restless. B.R. Chopra's TV series, The Mahabharata, had only just wound up. Viewers had lapped up its sumptuous costumes, magic tricks, and declamatory speeches. And here was Brook offering their divinities, their gods, dressed in brown robes, miners' crowns, and speaking like you and me. The audience felt the gods had been degraded. But the Japanese theatre writer Shogo Ota went one further than Brook. He created a trilogy of plays in which silence became the mode for expression. His plays, The Earth Station, The Fire Station, The Water Station, were the product of three radical questions which he asked himself. He asked, why do I need costumes? Why do I need a set? Why do I need words? The Water Station, which we saw in Mumbai, answered all three questions with a resounding, I don't need any of them. Peter Brook said there were very few theatre directors who would have dared to ask them those questions, for such questions lead to a void where there were no markers to guide a director. But Ota wanted a void where not a single idea of what theatre was or should be remained. Only then could he create something truly new. When he wrote The Water Station, he knew that he might be boring the audience, but he was willing to take the risk to see whether the performance of actors simply moving choreographically to the background sound of water dripping from a tap would be enough to speak to the audience. As he expected, it did not speak to some, but for many others, it was an opportunity to discover in themselves the ability to hear unspoken speech. For that is what silence is. It is wordless speech. I spent 6 months of last year translating a book of essays on the artist V.S. Gaitonde, who was born to Goan parents, spent his early childhood on this soil, and drew his first pictures here. His way of being and his work both reflected the profound influence of Zen Buddhism. Towards the end of his life, he would sit for hours staring at a canvas without making a single mark on it. When his gallerist urged him to paint, he said, "But I am painting. It doesn't have to be on canvas. It's there in my mind." Ram Kumar, the artist, who was one of his very few close friends, has narrated in this book, which I translated, that the two of them would often go together, see a show, sit over cups of tea, till one or the other said, "Chalo, chalte hain?" And those would be the only words that had been spoken between the two of them. On this note, I would like to end with Pablo Neruda's poem, Keeping Quiet. Keeping quiet. Now we will count to 12, and we will all keep still. For once on the face of the earth, let us not speak in any language. Let us stop for 1 second and not move our arms so much. It would be an exotic moment without rush, without engines. We would all be together in a sudden strangeness. Fishermen in the cold sea would not harm whales, and the man gathering salt would look at his hurt hands. Those who prepare green wars, wars with gas, wars with fire, victories with no survivors, would put on clean clothes and walk about with their brothers in the shade, doing nothing. What I want should not be confused with total inactivity. Life is what it is about. I want no truck with death. If we were not so single-minded about keeping our lives moving, and for once could do nothing, perhaps a huge silence might interrupt this sadness of never understanding ourselves and of threatening ourselves with death. Perhaps the earth can teach us, as when everything seems dead and later proves to be alive. Now I'll count up to 12, and you keep quiet, and I will go. Thank you.
Your glasses? Are these your glasses? had to contribute my silence there. Thank you, Shantabai. That was really beautiful. An exploration of silence through music, through literature, poetry, and yet we have to keep speaking, we have to move through words. I'm really at a loss for words. We have also seen a kind of interplay of silence with both the keynote speakers, where Shumona spoke about the silence that begins before the first letter is spoken, the spaces between the plants and their script, their language. And Shantabai spoke so eloquently about silence in every walk of life and every form of art. And talking of art, it's now time to unveil the artwork of GALF 2025. We have with us our artist, Sonia Rodriguez Sabarwal. Sonia, yeah, Jerry is a big fan. Sonia obtained her bachelor's degree in fine arts from the Goa College of Arts, Mumbai University. In 1992-93, she worked with a research grant from the Lalit Kala Academy in New Delhi. She says, my paintings are centered around a story of relationships, the tenderness of the human mind, body, and soul, the meeting of human and organic forms of nature. I request the president of ICG, Yatin Bab, could you please come on stage? And Bai, let's be present at the unveiling of the artwork. Come, Bai and Yatin. Let's all unveil the artwork together. We've had many great artists, Amrita Patil, Lakshman Pai, Subodh Kerkar, Loretti Pinto, Viraj Naik, and many prominent image makers create artwork for GALF all these years. I also request our keynote speakers. The unveiling of the artwork for the Goa Arts and Literature Festival 2025, the 13th edition, a 15-year-old festival, and the 13th artwork. A big hand for the artist and the artwork. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Bai. Thank you, Yatin. And we are going to have a small performance of a bhajan here by Apurva Khosla. She's also a student of Sonia's, based in New Delhi, and she happens to be in Goa for some work sessions. She is a student of Hindustani classical music of the Agra Gharana. I request, I think Sonia is going to tell us something about the artwork, her source of inspiration, and also about Apurva's performance.
Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A special thank you to the International Centre Goa, ICG, the Goa Writers Group, and a very special thank you to Bhai Damodar Mauzo and Vivek Menezes, co-curators of GALF. I, Sonia Rodriguez Sabarwal, am honored to be the artist for the 13th editions of the Goa Arts and Literature Festival. This festival has become and is a vibrant platform for creative minds to engage, inspire, and celebrate the power of words and art. I am honored in presenting my artwork titled the goddess of art and literature. The goddess of art and literature. The goddess of art and literature sits gracefully holding a quill of peacock feathers poised in deep contemplation. This representation of the goddess is a metaphor from Kabir's bhajan, Jeeni Jeeni Re Bini Chadariya. The sacred verse speaks of the human body, delicately woven like a fine ethereal cloth, interlaced with the veins Ingla, Pingla, and Susmana Nadi, spiraling through the 8th lotus chakra. It is an embodiment of the 5 elements, each artistically represented: earth, water, air, and space, while the radiant halo symbolizes fire, adorning her divine presence is the vibrant aboli flower, the state flower of Goa, adding a touch to the celestial beauty of her aura. I present to you now Apurva Khosla, my student in the arts, to perform the bhajan.
Hello everyone, and I'll perform the bhajan for all of you now. Jeeni jeeni re bini chadariya, काहे के ताना काहे के भरनी, कौन तार से बीनी चदरिया, इंगला पिंगला ताना भरनी, सुख मन तार से बीनी चदरिया, 8 कावल दल चरखा डोले, 5 तत गुण तीनी चदरिया, साई कोसियत मास 10 लागो, ठोको ठोको के बीनी चदरिया, सो चादर सुर नर मुनि ओढ़ी, ओढ़ के मैली कीनी चदरिया, दास कबीर जतन से ओढ़ी, जो किथ्यो धरी दीनी चदरिया, झीनी झीनी बीनी चदरिया. Thank you everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Apurva. Thank you, Sonia. And the artwork is there, resplendent for all of us to gaze upon. Goa is a very strange place. A lot of professions seem to switch around and change places. So you can have a dentist who turns into a financial consultant. You have a medical doctor who becomes a dance instructor. And you can have another medical doctor become an artist, a fine artist like Dr. Subodh Kerkar. And you can have a bodybuilder with massive biceps become a poet. And that's the man we have today, Ramesh Gadi. He is our poet for the evening. And he hails from Saligaon. I asked him what is his boli, what is his dialect. He said, Bardezi. We have Shashti, Bardezi, Pedne, Antruzi. These are the various dialects of Goa. So Ramesh's dialect is Bardezi, but it's of course understandable to us all. His poetry collection is titled Awa is alias Auntie. My mother has grown old. He has worked in Abu Dhabi, in the Gulf, in the corporate field, and he has his own fitness center in Saligaon. Azun Solta Mare Ramesh. Yes, where he still works out. And his poetry is about the raw earth, the soil of Goa, the farmer. When I first heard him, I really felt that tingle up my spine of being in that knee-deep water among the paddy fields, listening to the birds sing. And that nostalgia of missing his village soil came to him when he was out there in the Gulf, in the Middle East, working and missing all this very intensely, as all Goans who have grown up in the villages do. So I now request Ramesh to present his poetry.
Okay. Okay. Good evening, everybody. Deobari Sans Dion. It's a blissful evening for us. Given chance to recite my poetry along with Shobhana Roy on the stage and Shanta Gokhale. I feel like Galli ka Shokra batting with Virat and Sachin Tendulkar. And honor, I feel the honor is for my mother tongue Konkani, where I'll be reciting my poetry in Konkani about few verses. I'll recite in English. I come from a small village, as said, Saligaon, about 18 kilometers from here. Saligaon is a small village, agrarian village, but the village has changed. It has not remained same like before, as the tourism started growing. We used to have 2 barber shops, now we have 12. We have 2 petrol pumps. We have 2 police stations close by. We have 3 supermarkets. We have a garbage plant. Sorry, we don't call it garbage plant. Waste management plant. We take it as insult when somebody says that it's a garbage plant. It's a new lingua, you could say. And very special thing, we have 3 old age homes. We boast about all other things, but not about the old age homes. Or does it suggest that we have gone wrong somewhere and we are not taking the care of our elders? I'll recite the poem in Konkani, but few verses I'll start with English translation to get the feel of it. For me, it will not matter at all. For me, it will not matter at all. Then you may rest my head to the north or south. Then you may rest my head to the north or south, to the east or west. For me, it will not matter at all. You may place that lit lamp. You may place that lit lamp near my head or my feet, near my shoulders or near my left ankle. For me, it will not matter at all. Into my wide open mouth, into my wide open mouth, you may put jaggery or sugar. You may, on my forehead, you may smear dark ashes or paint my face with the dark red vermilion. It will not matter at all. Let me start with Konkani. If you understand, then I'll carry on with the Konkani. I think Shanta Gokhale, madam, will definitely understand Konkani. And all Bengalis, I assume all Bengalis understand Konkani very easily. So Shobhana Roy also. Our accent is same. We open the huge mouth. Am I correct, ma'am? Okay, so म्हाका कांयच फरक पडचो ना. म्हाका कांयच फरक पडचो ना. मागीर तुमी ती निर्जीव म्हजी तकली पूर्वेक करात वा पश्चिमेक. मागीर तुमी ती निर्जीव म्हजी तकली पूर्वेक करात वा पश्चिमेक, उत्तरेक करात वा दक्षिणेक, म्हाका कांयच फरक पडचो ना. ती घशेन काळी जाल्ली दिवली ती घशीन काळी जाल्ली दिवली म्हज्या पांया कडेन पेटयात वा तकले कडेन बुजा कडेन नाल्यार दाव्या डोक्या कडेन म्हाका कांयच फरक पडचो ना. उक्त्या म्हज्या तोंडांत तुमी, उक्त्या म्हज्या तोंडांत तुमी मागीर साकर घालात वा गोड, उक्त्या म्हज्या तोंडांत तुमी मागीर साकर घालात वा गोड, आनी कपलाक म्हज्या काळो बुको लायात, कपलाक म्हज्या काळो बुको लायात, नाजाल्यार रंगयात म्हजें सोण तांबड्या भडक शेंदुरांत, म्हाका कांयच फरक पडचो ना. कण्याचे निश्णीक म्हजे, कण्याचे निश्णीक म्हजे कोणी मारचो खान, कण्याचे निश्णीक म्हजे कोणी मारचो खान, सरणांक म्हज्या उजो पेटोवंक पयलो कोणाचो मान, सरणांक म्हज्या उजो पेटोवंक पयलो कोणाचो मान. अरे नाका हो तमाशा फुकटो, अरे नाका हो तमाशा फुकटो, तुमी कोणूय पेटयात धोकटो, म्हाका कांयच फरक पडचो ना, म्हाका कांयच फरक पडचो ना. तोंडा वयल्यान मारीत बोबो म्हजो शिवडो कोण गा फोडटलो, तोंडा वयल्यान मारीत बोबो म्हजो शिवडो कोण गा फोडटलो, तांबयान भरून तीर्थार व्हरून म्हज्यो अस्थी कोण गा सोडटलो. अरे ती म्हज्या म्हाताऱ्या हाडांची पूड, ती म्हज्या म्हाताऱ्या हाडांची पूड तुमी गंगे सोडात वा सोडात व्हरून घरा फाटल्या हागुड्ड्या व्हाळात, म्हाका कांयच फरक पडचो ना. रांदचे कुडीक म्हज्या बाराव्याक, रांदचे कुडीक म्हज्या बाराव्याक जेवण कसलें शिजतलें, रांदचे कुडीक म्हज्या बाराव्याक जेवण कसलें शिजतलें, पोरन्यो म्हज्यो यादी काडून शेले कितले भिजतले, पोरन्यो म्हज्यो यादी काडून शेले कितले भिजतले. सुतीक सोंपलें म्हणून दायजी खोशयेन वचून न्हिदतले न्हिदों राणीचे, म्हाका कांयच फरक पडचो ना, म्हाका कांयच फरक पडचो ना. केळी खोल्यार पिंड ठेवून कावळ्याक कोण जापयतलो, केळी खोल्यार पिंड ठेवून कावळ्याक कोण जापयतलो, यो रे कावळ्या खा रे पिंड काकूळ तायेन आपयतलो. मागीर तो लेंवटी मुड्यो कावळो, तो मागीर लेंवटो मुडी कावळो चांचयत पिंड खातलो काय पयस खंय तरी उडून वचूं बाबडो, म्हाका कांयच फरक पडचो ना. अरे कुडींतलें आटोवन रगत, कुडींतलें आटोवन रगत तुमकां आमी करता व्हड, कुडींतलें आटोवन रगत तुमकां आमी करता व्हड. जाणटेपणी आमचेंच वजें, जाणटेपणी आमचेंच वजें तुमकां लागूंक लागता जड, जाणटेपणी आमचेंच वजें तुमकां लागूंक लागता जड. भाटां बेसां इस्टेटीर, भाटां बेसां इस्टेटीर फक्त आसता तुमची नदर, सांगात कशें लाभलें यश तुमकां आवय बापाय बगर, सांगात कशें लाभलें यश तुमकां आवय बापाय बगर. आयक, मेल्या उपरांत नाका विधी, मेल्या उपरांत नाका विधी, नाका म्हाळ, नाका श्राद्धां, नाका तुजें पिंडदान, नाका तुजें पिंडदान. जाताच जाल्यार जाणटेपणार दियात आदाराचो खान, दियात आदाराचो खान, दियात आदाराचो खान, दियात आदाराचो खान. देव बरें करूं. So do you understand the Konkani version, or do you? So should I stick to Konkani? It's like, it's like having a original orange juice and Tetra Pak orange juice. If I have the translated version, it will be like Tetra Pak orange juice. So you want the original or Tetra Pak? Thank you. As I said, I was in GALF. I was not a poet or writer at all. I was an athlete. I'm a farmer. I had my cattle, I had my milk business, and then I went to GALF. And I got lost. It was like going from a garden to a desert. I felt very nostalgic. I used to work for a health club. While going to the health club on the way, I used to get a garden, a grass cutter, Sri Lankan grass cutter. I used to meet him every day with his lawn mower. I used to stand there for 10 minutes and watch him. Then we had a horse stable. There were two Pakistanis, Asmat and Ibrahim. They become my friend. I used to spend my 10-15 minutes over there. My Goan friends who used to work with me, they got really irritated. अरे परत वचून त्या पाकिस्तानाकडे आणि त्या श्रीलंकनाकडे वचून सर रावता. Why I should stand next to the gardener? The smell of the garden used to take me to Goa. I used to feel very sentimental. And the horse stable, I used to feel like I'm standing in my cow shed. In the evening when I told my friends, because of that smell of the soil, I'm standing over there. One of my friends from Perne said, then why don't you tell your mother to send some soil? That was before 25 years. I used to write long, long letters. So in fact, I told my mother, send some soil. So she was scared. भुरग्याक कितें तरी जालें हां, तो सांगता माती बी धाड म्हणून मातसो प्रसाद घे. My mother told my father, better go to the temple. Something wrong with the son. He is asking me to send some soil in the letter. So, in the evening, I used to always write my diary. I wrote few lines on my diary, and that became my poetry. आवय म्हाका गोंयची माती चिटीन थोडी धाड गे. Let me recite to you. आवय म्हाका गोंयची माती चिटीन थोडी धाड गे. आवय म्हाका गोंयची माती चिटीन थोडी धाड गे. फांतोडीचेर सपनांत येता शेतां आनी माड गे. आवय म्हाका गोंयची माती चिटीन थोडी धाड गे. गोट्या फाटलें तणा कुडें घरां म्हाका आपयता. गोट्या फाटलें तणा कुडें घरां म्हाका आपयता. किरकिऱ्याचें मस्तें पोर न्हिदेंतल्यान जागयता. किरकिऱ्याचें मस्तें पोर न्हिदेंतल्यान जागयता. नजरे मुखार नेमान येता पंगाऱ्याचें झाड गे. आवय म्हाका गोंयची माती चिटीन थोडी धाड गे. आवय म्हाका गोंयची माती चिटीन थोडी धाड गे. घरच्या शिरब्या हळसाण्याचें सामारें गे दिसता खायन. घरच्या शिरब्या हळसाण्याचें सामारें गे दिसता खायन. दांत्या वयल्यो पोरण्यो वोवयो तुज्या वांगडा दिसता गायन. धाडूंक म्हाका पोरसांत वचून मस्का शेंगो काड गे. आवय म्हाका गोंयची माती चिटीन थोडी धाड गे. पयशा फाटल्यान धांवपाचो हो खेळ आमी मांडलो गे. पयशा फाटल्यान धांवपाचो हो खेळ आमी मांडलो गे. कुडी जरी आमच्यो हांगा काळजा गाबे सांडले गे. दोळ्या मुखार धांवून येता ती मस्ती आनी लाड गे. आवय म्हाका गोंयची माती चिटीन थोडी धाड गे. आवय म्हाका गोंयची माती चिटीन थोडी धाड गे. Those of us who are born in 60s and 70s have seen different Goa. Those huge banyan trees, people trees. Then the fear about going in the darknesses. This poem will take you to that era. Kon asa thai? Who is there? काळखेले रातीर पिशडुल्ली न्हीद. काळखेले रातीर पिशडुल्ली न्हीद. अंतुले बिदीन जाणटेली चीज. अंतुले बिदीन जाणटेली चीज. चिचेच्या मुळांत फुटिल्लो नीस. चिचेच्या मुळांत फुटिल्लो नीस. निचाच्या फुडें केगदीची वय थरथरून हालता. थरथरून हालता. कोण आसा थंय? थरथरून हालता. कोण आसा थंय? रानाच्या वण्ण्यार. रानाच्या वण्ण्यार म्हारिल्ली काज. काजीच्या मुळसांत अनाची पाज, पाजीच्या आड्याक आळवतीचो फोण, पाजीच्या आड्याक आळवतीचो फोण, मोडिल्लो खुरीसान दुकराची कोण, कोणीच्या पाणयान शिरशिरता मय, कोणीच्या पाणयान शिरशिरता मय, अमाशे रातीर कोण आसा थंय, अमाशे रातीर कोण आसा थंय. शिमेच्या गोंयण्यार बोडकेलो वड, शिमेच्या गोंयण्यार बोडकेलो वड, तांबडेल्यो गुडयो गुगमाची रड, मध्यानी रातीर म्हारवाच्यो कुलो, मध्यानी रातीर म्हारवाच्यो कुलो, दोंगराचेर घुमी कोण मारता उलो, उल्याचेर उलो भिवपुरी लय, उल्याचेर उलो भिवपुरी लय, जरगते रातीर कोण आसा थंय. व्हाळाचे मुशीर मसनाची वाट, व्हाळाचे मुशीर मसनाची वाट, वाटेच्या खाला राम पुरसाचें भाट, वाटेच्या खाला राम पुरसाचें भाट, भाटांतले कुडीत नाल्लाची रास, भाटांतल्या कुडीत नाल्लाची रास, खिळखिता दार पूण कोणाक ना आस, खिळखिता दार पूण कोणाक ना आस. कितें निम्याचो भंय, निम्याचो भंय वचून तूं पळय, भिरांकूळ रातीर कोण आसा थंय, भिरांकूळ रातीर कोण आसा थंय. माय लास्ट पोयम ऑफ द इवनिंग. जेन्ना भाटां विकून सोंपलीं, विकून जेन्ना सगळीं भाटां विकून सोंपलीं, विकून जेन्ना सगळीं भाटां विकून सोंपलीं, बिल्डिंगेची बियां थोडी शेतान व्हरून ओंपलीं. विकून जेन्ना सगळीं भाटां विकून सोंपलीं, बिल्डिंगेची बियां व्हरून शेतान थोडीं ओंपलीं. थोड्याच तेंपान शेतान जालें बिल्डिंगेचें रान, थोड्याच तेंपान शेतान जालें बिल्डिंगेचें रान, आनी पयस देशाक पळून गेलें कोगुळाचें गान, पयस देशाक पळून गेलें कोगुळाचें गान. कापून आमी सगळीं दोंगरा रानां कापलीं, कापून आमी सगळीं दोंगरा रानां कापलीं. थोडी बिल्डिंगांनी थोडी कचऱ्यान व्हरून धापलीं, थोडी बिल्डिंगांनी थोडी कचऱ्यान व्हरून धापलीं. काजी आम्या चवराचो पयस गेलो गंध, काजी आम्या चवराचो पयस गेलो गंध. इतिहासांत शेणून गेले सुरणाचे कंद, इतिहासांत शेणून गेले सुरणाचे कंद. गरीब रस्त्यार रडटना आमी दोळ्यार ओडली तोपी, गरीब रस्त्यार रडटना आमी दोळ्यार ओडली तोपी. कितल्यो खाल्ल्यो डोजरांनी धनगरांच्यो खोपी, कितल्यो खाल्ल्यो डोजरांनी धनगरांच्यो खोपी. शेवटाक नजरो आमचे मांडवीचेर पडल्यो, शेवटाक नदरो आमच्यो मांडवीचेर पडल्यो. जुगाराच्यो बोटी हाडून हड्ड्यार तिच्या सोडल्यो, जुगाराच्यो बोटी हाडून हड्ड्यार तिच्या सोडल्यो. विकपा सारकें आमच्या लागीं कांयच आतां उरूंक ना, विकपा सारकें आमच्या लागीं कांयच आतां उरूंक ना. सगळें विकून सोंपलें तरी भुको आमच्यो मरूंक ना, सगळें विकून सोंपलें तरी भुको आमच्यो मरूंक ना. देव बरें करून.
देव तुकाय बरो करूं रमेश बाब. He gave us some beautiful poems. म्हाका कांयच फरक पडचो ना. If you didn't care for me in my life and my old age, to hell with you after I'm dead. I don't care what happens. And avoi म्हाका गोंयची माती चिट्टीन थोडी धाड गे. Send me a little go on earth in that letter that you write. And of course on darkness. कोण आसा थंय? I like the way he said darknesses. Very often we are used to saying just darkness. There are darknesses in our lives, different kinds of darknesses. Thank you, Ramesh Bab. And now I request our guests, our speakers to kindly take their seats as we get ready for our book discussion. with William Dalrymple in conversation with Vidya Deheja. May I request Mr. Dalrymple and Ms. Deheja to please come onto the dais. Thank you, Shantabai.
Thank you.
No, my pleasure. Just guide her. One of my friends asked me, he said, "Oh, you'll have had 13 GALFs, huh? You'll have had 13 literature festivals in Goa. What was the use of all that? What did you all achieve? Look at Gaza, man, they are still bombing the hell out of them. Look at Ukraine. Look at America, they elected Trump again." Yeah, I said, yes, they elected Trump. And we elected a government which is so proud and so tolerant of everyone and such noble upholders of democracy. Yes, the US elected Trump again. And he said, what are you all doing to save the world? You all don't make any change. You all can't save the world in any way. I said, why are you asking us writers to save the world and change the world? Why don't you go and ask the fisherman or the baker or ask the parish priest what he's doing to save the world? Why can't you just leave us to write our books and to be in conversation and to have our biryani and beers after the Lit Fest? So that was a question which showed that he seemed to have to look to writers that we would do something better to save the world or to improve the world in some way. And I asked myself, with all of the world turning to the far right and getting more and more intolerant, what do we do as writers? In that great sea of intolerance and violence and unhappiness and bigotry, I think we throw life buoys to each other while we are sinking, as the Titanic goes down, holding on to that plank of wood. We throw life jackets, we throw life buoys, and while we are hanging on there to those planks, we also tell all those survivors to look up at the sky, see how beautiful the moon is. We had a red moon last night. I wonder where it is right now. And perhaps that's what we do as writers. Mr. Dalrymple and Deheja, Madam Deheja, please. William Dalrymple, as we all know, is one of our great historians and a best-selling author of award-winning books like The White Mughals, The Last Mughal, Return of a King. He is a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, the Royal Asiatic Society, and the Royal Society of Edinburgh. And he is well loved for being the co-founder of the Jaipur Literature Festival and has a great affection for our Goa Arts and Literature Festival as well. In conversation with him, discussing his book, The Golden Road, How Ancient India Transformed the World, is Vidya Deheja. She is a Barbara Stoller Miller Professor of Indian and South Asian Art at Columbia University in New York. She has received a Padma Bhushan for her accomplishments, and her work ranges from the Buddhist art of the BCE centuries to the esoteric temples of North India, from the sacred bronzes of South India to art under the British Raj. She has published written books, The Thief Who Stole My Heart, The Material Life of Sacred Bronzes from Chola India, and The Unfinished, Stone Covers at Work on the Indian Continent, and various other books. I hand it over to you.
Perhaps I'll start by welcoming William Dalrymple to Goa, since I consider myself a Goa resident at least half the year. And thanks, of course, to the Goa Arts and Literature Festival for this opportunity to have a conversation with William Dalrymple. You all know his book right now, the latest one, The Golden Road, How Ancient India Transformed the World. It has got rave reviews across the world. And I'm going to read you some of those reviews. But just before that, let's take a quick look at the structure of this book of 484 pages. But you can relax, because the actual book itself, the text itself, is only 300 pages. The remaining almost 200 is notes, footnotes, and bibliography and other end matter. His book, he explains, tells the story of the diffusion of transformative Indian ideas, first around Asia, then around the wider world. He clarifies that further, and let me just read what he says. For a millennium and a half, from about 250 BCE to 1200 CE, India was a confident exporter of its own diverse civilization, creating around it an empire of ideas which developed into a tangible Indosphere, where its cultural influence was predominant. During this period, the rest of Asia was the willing and even eager recipient of a startlingly comprehensive mass transfer of Indian soft power in religion, art, music, dance, textiles, technology, astronomy, mathematics, medicine, mythology, language, and literature. Quite a claim, you might say, and perhaps you understand why the footnotes amount to all of 100 pages. More on footnotes later if I have a chance. For those of you not yet familiar with the book, let me take you through the book's main themes, which are 4 in number. One is Buddhism and its movement into China, primarily via Central Asia. As he writes, Buddhism was India's prime export to China. The second is ancient India's extensive trade contacts with the West, with Aden and from there on to the Roman Empire, a fascinating story that you'll hear about from him in a few minutes. The third theme of the book is the movement to Southeast Asia, of gods, myths, language, literature, through merchants and traders, Buddhist monks, and Hindu Brahmins. With more and more of us all traveling to the east rather than to the Western Europe these days, many of you have probably encountered the temples of Thailand, of Indonesia, and Cambodia. This is a fascinating chapter in the history of movements, movement of peoples and ideas. The fourth and final section of his book traces the westward movement through Arab intervention of concepts like zero and the numerals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Mathematics, algebra, calculus, geometry were transformed and able to advance rapidly once the cumbersome Roman numerals used in the West were replaced by the 1 to 9 number system. Just think of the nuisance value of adding, subtracting, multiplying, or dividing with Roman numerals. Take the number 28. It was written as XXV111, or III, instead of the simplified 28. 169 was written as CLXIX, instead of just 169. You can understand what a difference our number system that we take for granted would make to mathematical advances. So let me go on to a few reviews. The Independent. With his new book, historian William Dalrymple has written a lucid and compelling account of why it is India, not China, to which we owe the most important developments in human civilization. A multifarious and engaging narrative which, like Indian trade, takes us in many directions. The Literary Review. A more masterful and accessible survey of a world-changing traffic in commodities, creeds, scientific insights, and artistic conventions would be hard to find. Financial Times. An outstanding history of the trade routes that linked a civilization's wealth and wisdom to the world beyond. The Guardian. Dalrymple is a born storyteller with a wonderful facility for expounding complex events with verve and clarity. Like any successful synthesis, his text draws on vast reading as well as a keen eye for telling details. And then the bookish elf, I love that name. The Golden Road is more than just a history book. It's a paradigm-shifting work that will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about ancient civilizations and India's place in the world. A mind-blowing panorama of India's forgotten role at the beating heart of the ancient world. I could read you dozens more reviews, but let's move to India. Hindustan Times. History as taught in India is a 19th century construct that is heavily Delhi-centric, ignoring the coastal zones from which bold sailors sailed all the way to Aden. Modern India has not told her ancient tale well, either to herself or to the world, a task newly accomplished by William Dalrymple's book. Dalrymple has pulled off a great service to the history of the ancient world, which is largely unknown out west and even to many in India. It would be useful for me to mention a review from a scholar who appears to belong to the field of subaltern studies. One such scholar speaks of your bias, William, in favor of knowledge of the head over knowledge of the hand. But of course, this is not a book about the history of an entire period. Williams is a targeted subject matter. This scholar speaks rightly of cultures encountering each other and borrowing from each other. He quotes Sheldon Pollock, whom William also cites, talking about global networks of begging, borrowing, stealing, imitating, and emulating. I'm sure that William would agree on that comment on the meeting of cultures. There's this entire swirl of interactions, economic, spiritual, and cultural. Yet this reviewer from the field of subaltern studies is ultimately complimentary, if reluctantly so. He writes, if we take Dalrymple's Indocentrism with a fistful of salt, The Golden Road is a great, eminently readable book. And then his final words, my hope is that it will be the last of the great books in its genre. Very clearly, he doesn't care for the genre of popular history, which is becoming more and more popular these days. Ultimately, here's what scholars say about a popular historian versus an academic historian. That history is a serious business. That in order to make a text engaging, they say that popular historians remove a lot of the unknowns that exist in history. That nuances are lacking, which is not the case in this particular case. I should also add that many such critics are opponents of the current political ethos. They worry about the book playing into politics, and that I think is a genuine and justified worry. Here's how I see the situation, William. I would say that you are not afraid to join the dots. Might you perhaps say it yourself? Might you agree with my assessment? William, I'm sure you realize that your comments about a generation of Indian academic historians failing to engage with the public has sparked controversy. You're right, of course. But academics counter again that history is a serious matter. They write that popular historians synthesize the work of academic historians to make it enjoyable to a reader. They speak of the fact, which will amuse you, that popular historians are supported by a network of trade publishers, literary festivals, and mostly upper caste mentors. True, but what's wrong with that? By the way, there are murmurs on the quiet that serious historians have not been asked to write reviews. There is a sort of resentment about that. Serious historians in India, I mean. So, let me start by asking you to say a few words about the title of your book, The Golden Road. Before I turn it over to you to take us through at least two of these before we stop and talk a little bit more, two of the sections.
First of all, before I say anything else, I should say that Vidya and I have been on stage many times before, but it has always been me as the chela questioning the guru. And I think this is the first time in maybe 10 or 11 or 12 times on together that I've had the honor of Vidya commenting on my work. So thank you very much for coming today. I've often come to see Vidya in Goa as well as in New York and sat at her feet, sometimes on her sofa in Goa, going through Chola inscriptions that she was reading for her latest work on Chola bronzes, a fantastic series of books. And it was sitting, working through Vidya's wonderful works at the beginning of COVID that really this book began to form in my head. So I owe you a huge debt. The title is specifically aimed to counter this very popular notion of the Silk Road. And I should perhaps straight away put up this map, which you see in a wide variety of forms like this. It's a map which moves from the Mediterranean on the left, Alexandria, Tyre, Antioch, these classical names on the Mediterranean, and through a series of dotted lines moving horizontally across Asia, passes through Anatolia, through Persia, through Central Asia, and through China until arriving close to the China Sea, which you can't quite see at the end. Could we move the, maybe I can do this, slightly over so you can see, no, we're losing slightly the edge of it, but to the end of the Silk Road in Loyang. And for example, at the moment, if you were to go to the British Museum, there's a wonderful exhibition called The Silk Roads, which contains a map very like this. 40 or 50 books a year are published in the Silk Road in different areas of the globe. And as you can see with this map, it's all very well, but it completely omits India from the picture. India is a complete absence on this map. There's the Himalayas and then nothing else. Even the dotted line coming around the bottom, which is sometimes called the Maritime Silk Road, which is a new addition to these maps, just bypasses India. It goes between Sri Lanka and India, heads off, and finally arrives at its destination at Gaza, improbably. It's my contention in this book that as far as the classical period is concerned, this map is more or less a lie. It does not represent any sort of reality that reflects the patterns of trade of the classical period. Because the simple truth is that Rome and China were unaware of each other's existence. Vaguely, there are a couple of references in both directions to the possible existence of a vast power in the West or the East. But no direct trade mission is ever known to have gone from Rome to China or vice versa. No diplomatic contact was made. But at the same time that there was this absence of any actual classical connect between Rome and China, India and China from the 1st century were in close and regular contact. From the moment, if you remember in your literature classes, when Octavius defeats Antony Cleopatra, Cleopatra famously puts an asp to her breast, and Octavius, as Augustus, his imperial name, seizes Roman Egypt. From that moment, India and the Roman world have a border, because it's only 2 months sailing from here, from the Goan coast, or from Kerala, or from Gujarat, or from the mouth of the Indus in Sindh, to Berenike, or the ports of Roman Egypt. And propelled by the monsoon, sailors from the 1st century began making not just regular trips, but annual trips. Strabo, a Greek-Roman geographer based in Alexandria, talks of fleets of 250 vessels waiting in Myos Hormos, one of the main ports of the Red Sea, to go together in great fleets to India. And then India, with this extraordinary providence of having a monsoon which blows very fast in one direction for 6 months of the year, then reverses itself and blows back again, allowing sailors who traveled from Goa or Kerala or Gujarat to Egypt to come back again equally fast. This unique property of the winds has meant that India has always been a coastal nation with strong trading contacts, which is why today there are still great colonies of Goans in East Africa, in the Gulf, because the winds have dictated it as such. And from the time of the Indus Valley, we have records of sailing expeditions going backwards and forwards. But these enormously accelerate at the time of the Roman Empire. And there's no better indication of this. Now, sadly, we are losing. Is there a techie here who can help save the edge of this? Is there any technical guy who can help us? Because we're losing the vital corner of this image. We're losing the right hand. No, we're going to have to have some sort of reset, because we're losing the whole of India on this map. Anyone can come along and help? It's on the screen here, but it's not being projected. Anyway, what you see here very clearly is the, here we go, hope this works. That's not necessarily an improvement yet. So what this map is it's a new map from the Archaeology Department of Oxford University, and it shows the distribution of Roman coin hoards. And inevitably there are massive hoards of Roman coins found all over Europe, all over Italy, France, Spain, across the Mediterranean coast, north and south, east and west, and down the Nile. And then no Roman coins in China, no Roman coins along the supposed route of the Silk Road, but enormous quantities of Roman coins found all over Kerala, Tamil Nadu, and the entire Indian coast, and Sri Lanka as well. So we've always assumed, I think, that the Silk Road is this ancient idea with an established past. In reality, it's an idea invented by a German geographer in 1877. Baron von Richthofen wrote of the Seidenstraßen in a book about a colonial railway he was planning from Berlin to Peking. The idea enters the English language in 1936, and it's only in the 1980s, when I'm at college, that you first get talk of the Silk Roads carpet shops in Istanbul start to call themselves the Silk Road Carpet Shop, and bars in Tashkent and so on. And then the Chinese state takes this up, and we have a whole series of often state-sponsored shows, exhibitions, conferences, scholarly articles, books in large numbers, which turn the Silk Road from a speculative idea. That's much better. If you look at this map, you can see, can we get a whole screen on the whole screen of this, see whether it's this, exactly this image, but a whole screen if we could. Nearly there. Anyway, what you can see here, the orange are the Roman coins, Italy, Britain, the Balkans, the Mediterranean coast, a couple in Aden, a couple in Afghanistan, an enormous orange splodge all over coastal India where Roman coins have been discovered. So my contention is that we need to, for this classical period at least, throw out this nonsense about Silk Roads, which didn't exist until the Mongols did create a through route right through the middle of Asia, and focus on the maritime power of India. And that's the first idea at the beginning of the book. And I talk about the spread of Buddhism from UP, from Lumbini, Bodh Gaya, and Sarnath, and the role that Ashoka plays in starting the Buddhist missions. Ashoka sends out what he calls Dharma ministers into the Hellenistic world, and any luck getting this whole screen? We're one click away from victory on this. We're doing very well. Anyway, I will keep going anyway, just to get the whole. Don't worry, I'm sure people can see anyway. So with the Buddhist mission, you begin to get Buddhism spreading first through India with wonderful caves like Bhaja, where Vidya, as a young graduate student with her husband Jay, camped out to study these early Buddhist monasteries in the, what period? When were you doing this? Early 70s? Yeah. Late 60s. Vidya was on to studying all this as her PhD. And you begin to get the wall paintings, first of all in Cave 9 and 10, then the rest of Ajanta and Pittalkora and various other sites. And Buddhism spreads to Sri Lanka, where Ashoka sends his son Mahinda. We've recently discovered Mahinda's stupa in Rajagala, the center of Sri Lanka. And this is the extraordinary map, which should be more widely known. If there were more Buddhists living today in in India, I'm sure we'd have this much more prominently known than we do. But it is in a matter of 400 or 500 years, Buddhism spreads from the Gangetic Plain right through what's now Pakistan, Afghanistan, into Central Asia, across China, into Mongolia and Siberia, through China to Korea, Japan, the Philippines, and then down to the whole of Southeast Asia, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and even the Philippines. So there is an extraordinary spread of not just Buddhism as a religion, but also a whole panoply of Indian learning and Indian ideas which spread with it. And so ideas like of time, like the yugas, ideas of geography, like Jambudvipa, these pass along with the Prakrit and Sanskrit texts across Southeast Asia, across Mongolia, through China, giving India a vast area of influence that I call the Indosphere in this book. And the scale and the amplitude of the Indosphere is still expanding. This is a wonderful head of a Buddha, which was found as recently as 2 years ago in the Red Sea port of Berenike. It's sort of vaguely Gandharan in style, but sculpted in Proconnesian marble from the Marmara Sea. It has sun rays coming from the back of the Buddha's head as if he's some sort of solar deity like Mithras or Sol Invictus. But most extraordinary of all, this extraordinary face, this beautiful sculpture, was found in a temple to the goddess Isis on the Red Sea coast of Berenike, erected by an Indian sea captain to thank for his safe arrival in this part of the world. And by the 1st century, we have a map based on the periplus of the Erythraean Sea, which is this very valuable source which talks about Goa and the whole of the west coast of India and the many ports which were on this coast. And it's very clear from this text, written in the 1st century, that India was as familiar to Roman sailors as any distant port in the Mediterranean. This was very much part of the world that the Romans knew, so much so that they needed a guide to tell them what particular products they should be bringing, what they could sell, what they can buy, and so on. Here we go. We've got another attempt to go full screen. Go for it. We're very grateful for this technical help. Forgive me for not being more technically adept myself. This is looking promising. And there is no equivalent for this for China. There is no record of a single Roman trading mission going to China. Here we go. Congratulations. This is a very exciting moment. We've forgotten the nuances of this, and yet, as Vidya well knows, in the Amaravati sculptures, and these particular ones are in the Chennai Central Museum, where they're atrociously badly displayed behind perspex and almost impossible to see. But if you go down on your hands and knees, you can see images what look very like Ethiopian envoys with cornrow hair, and the tall, elegant figure on the right offering gifts. And there's a whole world of Red Sea trade that we have forgotten, but which is here in the art if we look for it. There's also documents. This is a new document which appeared in Vienna about 20 years ago or 30 years ago, called the Muziris Papyrus. And it's a freak survival from the Egyptian desert of one shipping invoice, recording a shipment which was sent from Muziris, in what is now Kerala, past this coast to Alexandria. And what's important about this document is it contains the figures. And what amazed the economic historians who've been studying this is the value of these cargoes leaving India and arriving in Alexandria. Now, the kind of things that they're selling are illustrated in this mosaic in Sicily, presumably erected by a merchant who was something to do with this trade. In the center, you have a figure representing India, which seems to be based on a yakshi from some early Buddhist sculpture. Here she is, this voluptuous figure. And what has she got on her knees? She's got silk, because the periplus says, where did the Romans get silk from? Not from China. They got it from the coast of Gujarat. And if Rome and China ever did meet, it's probably in the bazaars of early Gujarat, Barbaricum, that they did so. But you also see an elephant, a tiger, circus animals. I don't know if any of you watched the latest Gladiator 2 when it came out, but there are exotic beasts there. In the case of Gladiator 2, a rhinoceros from the Red Sea trade turning up in the Colosseum. There's also behind the figure of India, she's holding an ivory tusk. The ivory trade was clearly one of the most profitable exports, and she's got pepper vines hanging from behind her, pepper being another of the major exports that's referred to in the Muziris Papyrus. And what the Muziris Papyrus has is not just the extraordinary price, because it's very clear that your coastal Indian ancestors were ripping off my poor Western ancestors something rotten, that we have receipts for a tiny quantity of black Indian pepper that turned up at the Hadrian's Wall at Vindolanda, and they were charging something a complete rip-off, something like 5 denarii by the time we got as far as Northumbria. But in the Maziris papyrus, you could have a single shipment, this one shipment for which we have the details, which contained pepper, ivory, malabathrum, which was an Indian product used in Roman perfumery, and cotton. So valuable was the contents of this one container that if it did successfully reach Alexandria, it would have made enough profit, according to the figures on this invoice, at least, to buy any estate in Roman Egypt, or indeed in central Tuscany, and have enough spare change to join the Roman Senate. So one large successful shipment of I think there's something like 20 tons of ivory mentioned in this document. One successful shipment like that could have turned you into the Elon Musk of Roman Egypt. God help us, but there you go. And we also have, even more excitingly, a column for the amount taken by the Roman customs. And my colleague Andrew Wilson's of All Souls, Oxford, has calculated that maybe as much as a quarter of the Roman imperial budget came from the customs take on the Red Sea coast. That so huge was the profits being made at Berenike and Myasomos by the Roman state that it paid for maybe a quarter or even a third of the Roman roads, the Rhine frontier forts, the forts across the Sahara Desert. This whole military apparatus of the Roman Empire is partially funded by the profits of the imports and the taxation upon them. And this is similar in reverse, just to move forward many centuries. The British Empire made many of its profits from the import of Chinese tea, and the duty on it paid for about a quarter of British imperial costs, to give you a comparative figure from the 19th century. So this was hugely important to the Romans, and it's the reason the Romans didn't ban the trade, because Pliny, sitting in Rome in the early 1st century, complains that India has become the sink of all the precious metals in the world. And we have other evidence. For example, Nero's mistress, Lolina Polina, who sounds like she's a displaced Punjabi, turns up at parties in Rome with Indian diamonds, onyx, sardonyx, all these expensive Indian gems all over her person, her tummy, even her shoes. And she brought the receipts to the parties to show other guests how much they cost. So it's not just, this behavior doesn't just happen in the Delhi wedding season. It's an old feature. So we're beginning to get a picture of the enormous Indian influence on the economy and the imports of Rome. But it went in two directions. In return for these exports like ivory and pepper, there are items like these gorgeous Greco-Alexandrian beakers turning up at the Bagram Horde in Afghanistan. We have examples of the influence of Coptic papyri on Gandharan wall painting. These are the painters of Miran, which seems to have a very similar iconography to the bottom papyrus, which shows Christ and his disciples. The top one is Buddha and his disciples. So you have the iconography crossing religions and turning up unexpectedly. But the biggest example of change is that this famous moment when Buddhist art moves, which you've written about so extensively, Vidya, about when Buddhist art moves from the aniconic, where the Buddha is represented as a flaming pillar, such as the top left, a stupa, bottom left, or the wheel of law, top right. And suddenly, in the 1st century AD, he becomes a human figure, often draped in something that looks like a toga or a hamation. And some scholars believe it's based on a figure of Apollo, but certainly you get in Afghanistan and Gandharan art, in Pakistan, these very classicized faces for the bodhisattvas. Look at the figure on the right. It could be a Roman emperor, and indeed compare Augustus on the left, a statue in Rome, to the drapery of the bodhisattva in the center here. And then the book goes, I just briefly rush through it, tracing the push of Buddhism into Gansu, into Western China, then through to the East, Buddhist art being reproduced often more crudely in China, Gandharvas and Apsaras that seem at home in Ajanta, turning up in Kizil and these other wonderful Central Asian sites. And then we have a whole section about Xuanzang, this famous traveler. The oldest among you would have known him as Huansang in your old textbooks, coming to Nalanda, the great Indian university, where, as you can see from the next slide, the same quadrangles that you find both in Islamic madrasas and later in Christian Western universities such as Paris or Oxford or Cambridge and ultimately in Harvard. These courtyards with a central courtyard, a cloister garth, and scholars' rooms left and right, 2 stories off the central courtyard. This plan for a scholarly establishment seems to start in India, in the Buddhist universities like Nalanda, the Mahaviharas, to find its way to the madrasas of Afghanistan, hence to Persia, hence to Egypt, hence to North Africa. Did you want to take things on from this point? Or so we have a little bit more on the Buddhist, the story of how this extraordinary Chinese empress, the Empress Wu. Should we talk about that? Or would you like to move on to Southeast Asia?
I'd like to make a couple of comments.
Sure.
I wonder whether this light ever goes on here in some manner. Could you just turn this light on? Ah, thank you. Thank you. The Silk Route or the Silk Road. I do agree that it's absolutely irrelevant to the Roman Empire. But I wonder whether you have underestimated the importance of the Central Asian route from India to China, the route that traverses both sides of the Tarim River and across the Taklamakan Desert.
That I don't dispute at all, yeah.
It is not,
Yeah.
certainly is not a Silk Route, but the importance of that route has to be acknowledged. I mean, sort of saying it's a Central Asian route, we won't call it the Silk Route, arose by any other name, perhaps?
It's this idea that there's an east-west motorway moving from Xi'an to the Mediterranean that I object to. I have no problem at all with the idea of course, I mean, not only no problem, but clearly it's crucially important. Xuanzang does this route along the Tarim Basin.
And so I wonder whether one might also take a look at Buddhist texts, which is something that you haven't had the time to do perhaps in this book. But the Buddhist texts that moved with Buddhist monks to China, so the vast majority of early Indian Buddhist texts, which were composed in one or other form of Prakrit and written in more than one Indic script, have been lost. What do we have? How are we resurrecting early Buddhism? We have Chinese translations of those lost texts. And let us consider the fact that the earliest known dated translation of a Buddhist text into Chinese dates to the year 148 CE, and it was translated by a Parthian prince turned Buddhist, Anshigao.
There's a whole chapter on Anshigao and Kumarajiva. Crucially
So
important.
this large-scale translation occurred, and then you talk about Kumarajiva, of course. But here's the point that is an interesting point that I think many people may not know, that very few early Indian Buddhist texts have survived in their original form in any Indian language or script Much of what we know today from early Buddhist texts comes from Chinese translations. Those Chinese translations in turn were translated into Tibetan. And then much later, those Tibetan texts were retranslated into Sanskrit, extending almost into the 20th century. It's quite a circle in which that whole thing went. So that's the only reason why, yes, there's no Silk Route, but the Central Asian route is
Crucial.
very much used and very crucial. So would you like to keep going?
Sure, shall I keep going? So, another figure that is, I think, not well known at all in India is this figure Wu Zetian, but she's a crucial figure of cultural transference. She is a Buddhist young woman who gets recruited to the harem of the first Tang Emperor Taizong. She is 15, he is 60. And she's obviously an incredible figure. She somehow manages to avoid the fate of most young concubines, which is when the older man dies, they get shoved into a nunnery. She manages to jump into the bed of his son, Gaozong. So we have on the left Taizong, Wu Zetian, who looks rather an old boot in this picture, but looks rather more alluring in the Chinese soap opera, which has come out lately and been there's something like a sort of 200 part, rather like the Mahabharata in the 1980s here. The story of Wu Zetian has become a 200-part Chinese story. And this extraordinary woman makes Buddhism briefly the state religion of China. A crucial moment whereby it doesn't last long, but for this brief period, Taoism and Confucianism are demoted, and Buddhism, an Indian religion developed on the banks of the Ganges, becomes the court religion during the reign of Wu Zetian. And this is, if you like, the high watermark of Indian influence in China. Never again will Indians be so extraordinarily influential. And we know that Wu employed many graduates from Nalanda, or monks who had certainly been to Nalanda at various points in their life. And we have a whole series of Indians taking official positions in the court in China. For example, a character called Siddhartha Gautama, you can't get a more Buddhist name than that, taking over the astronomy bureau in Xi'an. So India has this moment. And the same time as this is happening, the same is happening in Southeast Asia. We saw in the early part of the book how important the Roman trade was during the classical period. Rome falls in the 5th century, and suddenly those Red Sea ports, which had been so crucial for the for trade between the two and the transmission of ideas and artistic currents between the two, they close down. And what happens is that Indian merchants, particularly the Tamil trading guilds that you've written so much about in these inscriptions, the people like the 500, pivot eastwards at this period. And you suddenly see a vast increase. Just as the Roman trade diminishes on the west coast, you get a sudden increase of Indian journeys coming out of ports like Nagapattinam and Mahabalipuram to Java, to Cambodia, through to the Mekong Delta, through the Malacca Straits. And we have records of touchstones of Tamil gold workers turning up at Bujang in Malaysia, in Thailand, at various sites, early sites in Vietnam and Cambodia, and references in the Jataka tales and in the Ramayana to the Savarna Bhumi, the lands of gold. So having got gold pouring in during the Roman period, when that stops, these trading guilds have to look for new sources of gold in Southeast Asia. And the result is an extraordinary cultural transformation in Southeast Asia. This is a picture of a boat from Borobudur, the sort of boat that you might have expected coming between the two. But at the same time as that's being sculpted, we're getting the wheels of law turning up in the mysterious kingdom of Dvaravati, what is now early Thailand. In the Bujang Peninsula in Malaysia, we get images of Buddhist monks, lingams, yonis, images of Lord Shiva turning up. but most dramatically of all in the Mekong Delta, where the Mekong debouches out into the sea. We get these extraordinary canals built by early Khmer rulers, and if you follow them, you end up at Angkor Boré, where one of the earliest temples in Southeast Asia can be found, earliest Hindu temples, and inside that temple was found now in the Phnom Penh Museum this extraordinary series of Khmer sculptures of Lord Vishnu. But what's interesting is that from the beginning, they're not anything that could be confused with a sculpture in Tamil Nadu or in the Andhra coast. Already they come fully fledged in a Khmer style that could never be confused. And from the beginning, the kind of Hinduism that develops in Southeast Asia is slightly different. For example, here we have Jayavarman II, one of the early Khmer kings, showing himself as Lord Vishnu. In the top right picture, you can see him holding a conch and a discus. Are there any images in this country of Tamil kings as Lord Shiva or as...
No,
Yeah.
That's entirely a Southeast Asian concept of the Devaraja.
The Devaraja, the god king. And you have these images of a local chieftain. He's surrounded by the 6th century by Brahmins who are Sanskrit literate. They introduce the Tamil Brahmi script, the sometimes called Pallava Grantha, which is the southern form of Brahmi, developed for the use on palm leaf, so these curvilinear lines that don't rip the palms. And as you can see with this picture, they're pouring water over the king in an abhisheka ceremony. And at this period, you suddenly find kings whose grandfather had been called Kodunga, or a Southeast Asian name, suddenly taking the names Mullavarman, protected by, or Suryavarman, protected by the sun. These Sanskrit titles. So you have the spread very rapidly of Sanskrit kingship. You have the landscape transforming. So you have the names of Indian cities reappearing. You have a new Kurukshetra in Laos, a new Ayodhya in Thailand. And most mysteriously of all, the possibility, though it's etymologically controversial, that Mekong could be Ma Ganga in Khmer. And so you have a new Ganga even flowing through the middle of Southeast Asia, which itself is sacralized at the near north of Angkor Wat. You have these yonis and lingams carved into the riverbank near the source of one of the sources of the Mekong. And very soon after that, you get the first temples in Southeast Asia taking specifically forms related to the forms of Indian temples often in Tamil Nadu. So the left, we've got the famous Shore Temple at Mamallapuram. On the right, a temple at Gedong Songo in Java that has a similar profile, not identical though. And look how again that you have the Southeast Asian eaves around this temple. You have the Ramayana appearing at Prambanan, incredible 240 part episode by episode masterpiece, a transcription of the Ramayana into stone earlier than any similar sequence in India. You get the largest Buddhist temple built very much on the sort of design you get at Khazaria in Bihar, but here at Borobudur in Java in this extraordinary mandala form. And finally, by the 12th century, the largest Hindu temple ever built, Angkor Wat, built not in India, but in Cambodia. And arguably the largest and most successful militarily Hindu empire is not the Guptas, but the Khmers. They don't tell that to Mr. Modi. So you have the fact that the largest Hindu empire might not have been in India is something that is certainly worth considering. And the Angkor Wat, this vast structure, 4 times the size of the Vatican City within the outer moat. Then finally we get to the final part of the book, which is the westward passage. Vidya, I'm sure we'll have all sorts of comments.
I only want to, a quote from your book, which immediately relates to what you've just been speaking about. I find it very inspiring, and so why don't I read it? It's very short, but it's very meaningful, where you've said, for more than 1,000 years, India was a garden that issued seeds that once planted elsewhere flowered in new, rich, and unexpected ways. It is such a quotable quote, and it applies immediately to this. I had to read back to you what you've written in the book.
Very flattering.
Yeah.
So just to canter to the end, something that many people know in this country, but bizarrely no one knows outside India. Everyone in the West is brought up knowing about Pythagoras and Archimedes. Most kids in America or Britain will know about Archimedes in his bath shouting Eureka by the age of 6 or 7. But no one in the West has ever heard of Brahmagupta or Aryabhatta, mathematicians of equal importance in world history, arguably of greater importance, because we don't use the Greek numbers or the Latin numbers today. We use the Indian numbers, but we call them in the West Arabic numbers, because the West got them from the Arab world, but it's been forgotten now that those same numbers came originally from India. And here we have in inscriptions the first 0, K127 in Siem Reap in the museum near Angkor, this central dot on the second line between the sort of 2 tadpoles. That is the earliest dated 0 in the world. No one's claiming that those ideas were dreamt in Southeast Asia, but they spread along with Hinduism and Hindu kingship off to the west, off to the east, and then by the 8th century, you've got the earliest 0 with our version of 0, the polo mint 0, with the hole in the middle. That appears in Gwalior. An oddly mundane inscription about the number of marigolds that someone has to give to the temple, but this crucial moment where we get the 0 that everyone in the world uses today. You can argue that the Indian number system is the nearest thing the world has today to a universal language. And yet no one in the West knows it came from India. No one knows the names Brahmagupta or Aryabhatta, who played such an important role in defining these. And here is a map of how these ideas travel. You start with Brahmi, then there's the Gwalior inscription that I just showed you of the marigolds, and then it goes in 3 different directions. It goes through the Sanskrit Devanagari that continues in this country, the East Arabic numbers that are still used today in Egypt and Iraq and so on, and Saudi, and then crucially the West Arabic numbers developed in Morocco and Islamic Spain that by the 16th century become the numbers used on every mobile phone, every computer, all over the world, and they are an Indian invention. If I was in charge of Indian cultural soft power, I wouldn't have International Yoga Day, although very nice to have that, but to focus on this. This is arguably India's greatest gift to the world, an extraordinary contribution to mankind. How does it get out of India and travel westwards? Well, improbably through a Disney character. Hands up who's seen the Disney Aladdin here. Go on, admit it. You've all watched it with your grandchildren or your nephews and nieces. So Jafar, the villain of Aladdin, is actually a historical character. Jafar al-Barmakid, who is from a family that become the hereditary viziers of Baghdad, but before that, they are the hereditary abbots of the Buddhist monastery of Naubahar in Balkh in Afghanistan, who convert to Islam but are Sanskrit literate. And when they reach power in Baghdad in the 8th century, they call for the works of Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta to be brought to Baghdad, and there they are translated. there are a couple of unsuccessful early attempts by somebody called Al-Fazari to render this very complex Sanskrit verse, because Aryabhatta, as well as writing with incredible density in Sanskrit, writes in poetry so it can be memorized by students. The old Indian rote learning is an old tradition. It's only 2 generations later when Al-Khwarizmi, who comes from Khwarazm, and writes this book, the compendious book of calculation by completion and balancing according to Hindu calculation, that the works of Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta are successfully translated into simple, clear, and immediately comprehensible Arabic prose. And this book gets much, much copied across the entire Islamic world, becomes the basis of Islamic mathematics, and gets a nickname because the compendious book of calculation by completion and balancing according to Hindu calculation is a bit of a mouthful. It is known popularly as Al-Jabr, which gives us our word, algebra. While Al-Khwarizmi's name gives us our word, algorithm. So when you read about Facebook and the Google algorithm and all the rest of it, this is all starts off here in India with these series of ideas. And they travel through the Islamic world, along with chess, another Indian invention that takes root and travels westwards. So that, just to show on this map, so Sindh is where the embassy bringing the works, a book that is known in the Arab world as the Great Sindh Hind, which seems to be a compilation of Brahmagupta and Aryabhatta's work. It's brought to Baghdad, where it's translated by Al-Khwarizmi, who comes from Khwarazm, down to Baghdad to translate it. Then that translation goes across the Islamic world through Egypt, right up to Islamic Spain. And it is in Islamic Spain that the first Christian monks discover the Indian number system. And yet, as late as the 12th century, Europe is still sticking to the Latin numbers. Then an extraordinary thing happens. Pisa, city-state, great trading nation, establishes a colony and a trading station on the coast of Algeria. And the notary who founds the Pisan trading station takes his kids. And just as my kids went to school in Delhi and learnt some Hindi, so this kid, the son of the notary, learns Arabic and learns Arabic maths at school as a matter of course, as any kid would do by this period. Luckily for us, that kid is Fibonacci. And Fibonacci goes back to Italy in the 12th century, and he writes the book of numbers, the text that effectively takes the work of Al-Khwarizmi and translates it now into Latin. So it's a relay race. We've started with Aryabhatta in Pataliputra. We've moved to Brahmagupta sitting in Mount Abu. Those works get taken to Baghdad, where Al-Khwarizmi translates them into Arabic. They then go to Algeria, where Fibonacci takes it to Italy. And Fibonacci's work comes to the attention of Frederick II, the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, who is a keen scholar and interested in maths and philosophical matters. And he takes Fibonacci and he introduces him, very importantly, Vidya, to a Scotsman, Michael Scott the Wizard. There's an important walk-on parts for Scots in this story too, I'm glad to say. Michael Scott, from my country, tells Fibonacci that it's all very well, this highfalutin theory that you've written, he says, it's not practical enough. And he encourages Fibonacci to write a second edition with double accounting, weights and measures, currency conversion, and so on. A book that could be used by merchants, trading, and this book becomes the Italian mathematical primer. It's used by the Medici when they're planning their bank, and it's the source, if you like, of, you could say, without stretching it too far, of the Medici banking fortunes. But more specifically, it's picked up by Renaissance painters such as Piero della Francesca, who was famous at the time as a mathematician. He writes 3 mathematical treatises which his flatmate, Fra Luca Pacioli, takes to Milan and shares with his flatmate. The flatmate is Leonardo da Vinci. So this relay race has gone from from Bihar to Milan, from Aryabhatta to Leonardo da Vinci. And astonishingly, this is just a story which no one here really knows the full amplitude of. This vague sense that Aryabhatta is this important mathematician that you hear about at primary school, vague sense that Brahmagupta has something to do with zero. But these are major world achievements that this country should be trumpeting, and at the United Nations, people should know this all over, and they don't. No one's ever heard of these people outside India. It's the extraordinary moment that this is so. Anyway, that's my rant. Trouble is, the next thing that happens, of course, is that these numbers end up in Britain, where they lead to you can say, the kind of accountancy that they lead to the East India Company, who bring it back to India in a form that you would prefer that it didn't. Anyway, that's the end of the story. Vinny, do you want to bring it to a...
I think that's fine. Thank you so much, William, for introducing the audience to this extraordinary story that you put together in the Golden Road. Sure, there will be, in a book of this size, of this complexity, of this richness, there are bound to be a few errors that have crept in. It would be quibbling about small little matters.
I had a quick look at Vidya's copy just before we went on stage, and there's little scribble notes up and down the margins of things she spotted. The next edition, Vidya,
One, though, that I'll mention only because it's so clear, and you've taken Kanishka and made him into Kasura and Caesar. And the writing is absolutely clear. It says, Raja di Raja Devaputra Kanishka, Maharaja. Kanishka, it's not Caesar, so we've got to correct that one.
The paperback is coming out. We need
the only other thing that a few people who have actually read the book entirely, wonder about your, what they call mixing of dates or going backwards and forwards. You do that, but it's an awfully difficult thing to avoid, I think, in this sort of a book. But you talked about Bhaja, for instance, and you've got a para about Bhaja, and then there's a para in between, and then another para about Bhaja. And the one in between cites something which everybody will imagine is Bhaja, but it's actually 700 years later. So there are these sort of things which, will crop up.
I'm not going to take on Vidya, who camped in Bhaja as a 21-year-old.
Anyway, thank you very much for introducing the audience to this absolutely monumental tome. And are there copies of the book out somewhere for people to purchase?
They're certainly in the bookshops if they're not here. I don't know whether there's books on sale. Are the books on sale here? Or no? Yeah, there are.
Okay. So if any of you want William's signature, I guess this is the evening to buy it. And thank you for being an audience, our wonderful audience, listening carefully.
Thank you, Vidya, for this incredibly scholarly and kind and generous overview of the book. Thank you so, so much.
Thank you, William, and thank you, Vidya. That was really beautiful exposition and criticism, meeting of minds of two great scholars. This brings our inaugural event of the 13th edition of the Goa Arts and Literature Festival to a close. We have a lot of exciting events, book discussions, book launches in the 2 days ahead, and we hope to see all of you at the ICG halls, Aboli, Zuari, Mandovi, and let's have a great time. Thank you, everyone. This is your host, Jose Lorenzo, wishing you a good night. You really brought history to life. So gorgeous, really good. Amazing.
Where do you want me to go? Stay here outside?
You could sit, William, you could sit, have a seat there. I like the